All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on the world. I'm just going to offer some hopefully very brief, but maybe provocative remarks regarding the oppression from monuments. So, a little bit of scenario modeling. So, imagine that you are rude to your neighbors and you put rude paintings, statues in your own household, right? One day, those people come to live in your house and then experience those paintings, experience those statues. What do you do? Do you defend freedom of speech? Do you defend the history of your house? What exactly do you do? And how will those people react to that? I will come back to this when I sum up my my thoughts. But just to mention that from the 1960s onwards, there has been a rise or an increase of the number of ethnic minorities in Europe and also in the United States. So that has also demanded that business as usual, what we were seeing about those cabinets of curiosities and so on, it's no longer necessary. There is now a high level of sensitivity that is now required when dealing with monuments, when dealing with things that are from the dark past. Maybe in the past, the excuse was that, how many Africans do we have? Maybe we don't even have one. How many Asians do we have in London? Maybe not even one, but now they are there. The game is now different. What are monuments? And how do they express, how do they oppress people? So maybe some generalized position could be that monuments are broad, but collectively they are objects. They are material culture, right? And one of the problems is that material culture has a grip on people. Material culture can colonize people. So in fact, we can define colonialism, and that's one of the definitions shared by Chris Gozen and others. Colonialism is that grip, that hold, which objects, places, memories, structures, and landscapes have on people. So monuments are not benign. They oppress people just by their presence. And they are, able to colonize people. The reason why they are there is that they are meant to reinforce a particular kind of thinking, to celebrate a particular mindset, right? Here is this person who was stealing, plundering ships and so on. He is given the name, say, Francis Drake. That's a title, but this is a thief. Come on. Monuments, and honor systems, they go hand in hand, right? So you go and plunder, and then you are given a title. You are respected. You are respected for that. And the other thing then is that monuments are more than statues. They include architecture and also an ensemble of buildings, of monuments, such as a university. It also oppresses people. It also colonizes people. How about the disciplines themselves, right? That I study architecture, I study history, I study, divinity or theology. Aren't those other monuments of oppression as well? Because you are indoctrinated in a certain way of thinking, in a certain way of doing. Who are the heroes and heroines in those monuments, in those disciplines? That is oppression at its best. So that is why then the idea to decolonize the minds is a therapy. To say that, look, by talking about this mental emancipation, we are saying to people, remove that knee of oppression so that we can breathe. So those monuments, you know, they have a grip on us. They have, there are many things which they are, you know, imposing. So if monuments are not about valor, if they are not about celebration of specific, you know, events, why have we not built monuments of the poor? You know, to say that, you know, of the colonized, of the slaves, rather than having that plaque that said that, you know, the slave worked on plantations or something like that. Why don't we build the biggest of those monuments, right? To say, well, capitalism was fueled by your sweat, so we got our wealth, you know, and maybe with these monuments, we need to stop being racist to your kith and kin, which would be a new way of emancipation, a new discourse. So in wrapping up, then the oppression we get from monuments is subtle. It is also not subtle, you know, but collectively, whatever form it is, it leaves very large scars in the mind. It is a knee on the neck, and it is also about the abuse of human rights, right? Who wants to see violence being played and replayed and replayed? As you walk through those streets of Oxford, you get to see those reminders day in, day out, right? What effect does that have on your mental health? You know, that can't be good. Surely the toll that it has on someone's mind is something else. So, I mean, I come from Zimbabwe, and through the events of Mr. Cecil John Rhodes, my relatives died. They were dispossessed of their land and many other things. Then my office here in Oxford is next to Rhodes House. So every day, you know, what comes to mind when I see Rhodes House, you know, is that violence which is played and then replayed and then replayed. So that is how then these monuments oppress us. That is how they affect our well-being. So this also means that with some of these monuments, we then become trapped. We become prisoners of the past, prisoners of the present, and we live in a perpetual prison because of this oppression that we get from these monuments. So if we are then serious about human rights and so on, then this oppression that comes from monuments, we need to seriously consider it. We need to learn from it and to chart a way forward that hopefully will be better for our well-being and would also be emancipatory. Thank you.
Thank you, Padiush, Professor Shirikure. I'm Frida Larios, and I'm the moderator. I'm sorry I got one hour confused, and I thought it was 1 hour later. I'm on the traditional territory of the Nahuatl, Lenca, and Cacahuir people in El Salvador. Our ancestral name is Cuscatan. Thank you for that introduction, which is way better than what I would have said. So thank you, Professor. And I'm here today to try and create a rich and fruitful dialogue around the theme and the issue and the topic of the oppression from objects above people and above nature. And I would like to talk a little bit about myself to be able to come to this space, you know, and share my background. I regenerate ancestral iconographics from my people, and I also I'm an activist and live in Washington, D.C., even though I'm from El Salvador in Central America, the stringy bit of the Americas. And we're the smallest country in Central America, and went through a civil war with our neighbors, also in parallel to our neighbors, Guatemala and Nicaragua, for 12 years, and it finished in 1992. And we've been under 500 years, over 500 years of colonialist rule, and now the fourth generation of colonialism, which is also not only the monuments, but the new energy and the minories who are taking over our territories to be able to create other sources of more richness for corporations. So that is the phenomena that's happening at this moment in this part of my world. And we just had Professor Shadrach Shirikure, who is professor of archaeology at the University of Cape Town in South Africa and the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom. And we heard from you. I would like you also to please mention your pronouns. I'm she, her, and right now we're gonna hear, sorry, I'm gonna name our 6 panelists today. We heard a small warming up from Professor Shirikure. Now we're gonna, second speaker is Michelle Codrington Rogers, National President, NASUT Teachers Union UK, NASUWT Teachers Union UK. And our speaker number 3, Petrona Shemiyuli from Perpetual Debut from my same nation, now a nation of Cuscatan, El Salvador, who is a playwright, among others, and an activist and language facilitator for new generations. Speaker number 4 is Lavon Bell, a visual artist from the Virgin Islands. Welcome. And our speaker number 5 and panelist is Ruth Fallenbaum, a clinical psychologist of California. And our speaker number 6, Cyrus Ware, visual artist, curator, activist, Black Lives Matter activist in Toronto, performance disability art collective member from McMaster University. So this is our amazing lineup of panelists this morning and that afternoon over there on the other side of the Atlantic. And we are going to continue. I don't know if Professor Shirikuri would like to say a few other words since I wasn't able to introduce you, and then we will hear from Miss Codrington Rogers.
I'm happy to look back into the discussion and give an opportunity to others.
Brilliant. So do we have Michelle here on the floor?
Yes.
Or on the Zoom cloud? Yes, hi, Michelle.
No, thank you for such a warm welcome, and it looks very nice and warm where you are, so thank you. I feel very honoured to be on this panel. I managed to catch some of the previous session as well. Hopefully you have noticed that my surname is Codrington, and so it's always interesting to hear about kind of the opinion, I guess, the thoughts towards Christopher Codrington. That's not where I'm going to start. I will say that. So as introduced, my name is Michelle Codrington Rogers. I'm a teacher based in Oxford. I am an Oxonian. I am a member of the town, not the gown. And so I've grown up in the shadow of Oxford University. And the way I want to start it, I especially want to thank Professor Shirakuri, because he was able to articulate in a way that I probably won't be able to during my next 5 minutes or so. So I hope to build on what he said. But the place where I want to start is where do I belong? Where do I feel I belong? As I said, I grew up in Oxford. I'm proud to be an Oxonian, and one of the things that I've always loved about Oxford is being surrounded by the history, and that's something that I've always felt a kind of a connection to. But it's as I've grown older and understood more about what those symbols of Oxford represent and how they were built, the more it becomes uncomfortable for me. It's interesting engaging with the Oxford landscape as a non-academic. I don't get to go behind the doors. I don't get to see the plaques, the monuments, the paintings, the library. Yet I consider myself as part of the Oxford. As an Oxonian, I pay my taxes. I went to school there. My daughter goes to school in Oxford. It's part of who I am. Yet the academia side is part that is closed off to me. And so it was interesting listening to the talk about uncomfortable Oxford, and I'm going to pick up on a couple of points in relation to that, because I became involved in the Roads Must Fall campaign in, I think, 2015, 2016, when I was approached by some of the original organisers who were absolutely phenomenal and inspirational on so many levels, especially to me as an old activist, of the energy and their drive and their clear goal and clear focus of what they wanted to see changed at Oxford University. And I was approached and invited to speak at an event I was unable to speak at, and so I sent some words and continued to support as much as I could, and open spaces and keep spaces open, and make sure that their campaign was getting as much visibility as I could give it. And as a result of that, a symposium was organised in 2016 in relation to the Codrington legacy, which I was able to attend, and I learnt more about the white Codrington legacy than I've ever known. And then in 2017, the plaque was put up. So it's really important that when we talk about decolonisation and that we talk about the history, that our history is accurate, and we recognise the people who have played a part in every step. The plaque came out of the Codrington symposium, which was an interesting space as it was as a non-academic, and listening to people talking about the Codrington legacy. And for me and my family, the overall issue that we had in relation to the fact that even though we'd never been into the All Souls Library, which is now called, it's not called the Codrington Library anymore, it's kind of called, I think it's called the All Souls Library, to be fair, was that these are debates and discussions that are happening without us. And as people who've grown up in the shadow of the university and have worked and lived in the shadow of the university, when the plaque was being produced, we were given or we were asked for our feedback on the wording. And the wording did not recognise the humanity of our ancestors. In the UK, we are still grappling with the articulation of what slavery means and what it looks like and the true impact it had, because it was so far removed. And so me and my family had a conversation about the wording, and we advised the university how to improve the wording. And that's where the terminology has come from. It's not the end result, and it shouldn't be seen as the end result. It should be seen as part of a process. And I know that there has been a number of criticisms in relation to the plaque, but for me and my family, we wanted our ancestors, our blood, to be recognised, and for them to be starting to be given their humanity back. And when we talk about oppression, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the loss of humanity, the loss of individualisation, and we're fighting back against institutions but we're also fighting back against individuals who continue to allow this narrative to continue. And that has the wider societal impact. But when we talk about slavery, we are talking about exploitation. We are talking about not just economic exploitation, but social exploitation. We're talking about people who are torn away from their heritage. We're talking about rape. We're talking about child abuse. We're talking about physical maiming. We're talking about child rape. We're talking about family separation, and we're talking about the absolute disruption of connection of peoples. So I'll be honest, when we talk about the plaque, I understand there are people who are really upset about it. For me, the damage is more than words. And so when I talk about decolonization, I'm talking about organizations systematically thinking of how they are going to strategically undo the system that we exist within, which continues to keep, let's be honest what it is, white supremacy in the place that it is. The monuments should be about the debate, the discussion, but also it has to be about the action, because emotion is a huge part of it. But what I want to see, as somebody who has grown up in Britain, as a Black person who's grown up in Britain, as somebody who is a descendant of those who have been exploited, I want to see action that undoes the systematic supremacy that has allowed this to continue, this system to continue. So the monuments are there, and they need to be, we need to have the conversations around the monuments, but we also have to understand the people that should be centered as part of it. And as much as I can, I will, and I will push for to make sure that we are ensuring that we center the people and the humanity in it. But I think, as the previous speaker said, this is not just about the monuments, it is about the wider context and the wider impact it has on individuals, communities, and their families. I'm looking at Frida, wondering if I've gone to my time. If I've got one more minute, I'd just like to say, I've just got one more minute to say. Thank you.
Yes, please go ahead. One more minute.
One more minute. So I remember at an early age, I must have been about, I feel I was about 9, 10 or 11, a phone call happened and my dad picked up the phone, as he usually did. And I heard my dad raise his voice and slam the phone down. I went and asked my dad what was all that about. And he just said that was a phone call from an organization who were trying to promote and protect the Codrington legacy, and they had found our names obviously in some phone book, and they had rung us asking us to donate towards maintaining the Codrington legacy. Now this for me absolutely symbolizes what the debate and what the discussion and what the action has to be. It has to be making sure that people are educated and know what we're talking about when we talk about the hurt that has been caused, but also there's the action in place, but we recognize that there is the humanity and there is the legacy, not just of the people who are the monuments, but the people who were exploited as a result of them being able to afford to pay to have their legacy commemorated. I look forward to the panel and the debate. Thank you.
Perfect timing, Michelle. Thank you for sharing that personal experience on this space, a safe space, I hope. And we will continue with questions and answers after each one of our panelists can talk about their experience and their work. We're gonna welcome right now Petrona Shemiyulu Tapepechul de Bull Shields. Petrona is a two-spirit transgender woman from Cuscatan, the land known internationally as El Salvador. And she's the proud mother of the first US-born Nahuatl Nahua speaker from birth. And she's on the Council for National Association of Indigenous Salvadorans and is international, as well as myself. We're council members. And this is just a short introduction, and Petrona just came also to Zoom. We were confused with the time, but welcome, Petrona, and the microphone is yours.
Ayush, Frida, Yekpena, Muchiame Heme, Nahanituai Petrona, Shemi, Wangisuntuai, Tapepechul, Ipa Boshield, Nahaninemi, Wangipianuchan, Tik Chocolatecha, Neik Mantal, Panechinami, Piscataway, Iquachtugai, Washington, D.C., Nahaninesik Tik, Tik Mexicanos, Gushkatan, Neik Mantal, Panechinami, Nahuatl, Iquachtugai, Mexicano, San Salvador, Wang Nahani Mumachtiani pal ne Nahuatl, Wang Nusang Nahani Chiwada Miaktatka. Hello everyone, my name is Petrona Shemi Tapepechul Ipa Bolshield, Tapepechul de Bolshields. I live in Washington, D.C., which is the land of the Piscataway people. And I was born in Cuscatan, Mexicanos Cuscatan, which is known as Mexicano San Salvador. I'm very happy to be part of this conversation to talk about the intersection between gender and monuments, to talk about the issues that affect marginalized people for the benefits of World Heritage, or the benefits of, for lack of a better term, white supremacy. So yeah, I'm excited to have a little bit of conversation with you all about these themes. I'm not really sure exactly how long this introduction is or what I can really say here, but yeah, I got a lot of thoughts. I got a lot of thoughts about like the way that monuments work. I believe that monuments are not just the physical obelisks that are risen by colonial governments, but I also believe that in the age of coronavirus, where we are all completely online, monuments have begun to manifest in a different way, in a way that it's much more virtual, and one way that in my community it's manifested is through the co-option of indigenous languages, particularly the Nahuatl language, and the co-option of teaching, essentially teaching our indigenous tongue, where white supremacists' names are used to name schools for the Nahuatl language instead of using our own ancestral heritage to name our schools. And so he's dead now, but this monument that essentially represents the Nahuatl language is a white man, and that legacy has essentially pushed itself into the online world, where now everyone, where you talk about the Nahuatl language, no one knows about the elders, no one knows about the Nahuatl Tagatsani. They know about this white man. They know about this white man who has gone around the internet, spreading his book, sharing his knowledge that he co-opted from indigenous elders, and now he's a celebrated voice for the Nahuatl language. And so yes, I believe that monuments are much more than just the physical things that are risen by communities, but also these figures that we raise in celebration of white supremacy. I'm not sure if that's my time.
Padiush, Nuchagu, you have 1 more minute if you would like to mention your experience, maybe in Washington, D.C.
Sure.
Territory. Feel free. If not, we can continue, and then
Sure. There's here in Washington, D.C., It's the capital of the United States, where, you know, a lot of people come around the world to visit because it's the capital of the United States. Here in Washington, D.C., colonizers from around the world are celebrated. There's monuments of Queen Isabella. There's monuments of Christopher Columbus. There's monuments of other white supremacists that went around the territory of the American continent and terrorized indigenous peoples that are now being glorified and monumentized in Washington, D.C., because that's where the capital is. That's where everything happens. And so, of course, white supremacists are being celebrated here. And not just white supremacists that attacked and brutalized indigenous peoples of the lands that are now known as the United States, but specifically the genocidal maniacs from the Caribbean island, the one that murdered thousands of Taino people, Christopher Columbus and his comrades, and then went on to Central and South America to destroy more and more cultures. And we're celebrating them here in Washington, D.C. And even more than that, when we celebrate the deaths of the Piscataway people here in Washington, D.C., throughout bridges, all throughout the city, you see images of Indian heads posted across bridges. That is a celebration of the genocide of the Piscataway people. And this is what Washington, D.C. celebrates.
Padiush. Thank you. Many thanks, Petrona. And yes, Washington, and I think all capitals of the world are characterized by this phenomena. Unfortunately, yet, Black Lives Matter movement has as always brought, fought the fight. And during the pandemic, like you mentioned, there was at least more awareness of this during the protests, historic protests in Washington on Piscataway territory, with the indigenous nations as allies as well. We had our next speaker, but if they're able to join by the end, we will welcome them, and otherwise we will continue with Ruth Fallenbaum, who is joining us today. And Ruth is from Oakland, California. She's a psychotherapist and received a bachelor's from the University of California, Berkeley, Cal, and a PhD in social clinical psychology from Wright Institute, Berkeley. And she is the author of African American Patients in Psychotherapy, Understanding the Psychological Effects of Racism and Oppression, published in 2018. And has taught clinicians about working with immigrants and refugees and psychological aspects of work. Welcome, Ruth. Very early, I know, in California. Thank you for joining today. And you have around 5 minutes or less to be able to share your experience, any lived experience, your background, and your important work.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'll try and zip through this. First, I'm on Ohlone land. I'm speaking. Oakland is placed on the land of the Ohlone people. One of the insidious effects of racism on Black people in my benighted country is that they live in a world with non-African Americans who will not or cannot see them as individual subjects, and who suspects is an interesting slip because that's how they often do see them, and who can only see them through the lens of white supremacy. Being misrecognized is a regular occurrence for Black men, women, and even children, and even in this liberal part of the country where I live. It involves, for instance, the law-abiding African-American woman noting that she is again being followed by security guards in the shop, or the awareness as a Black man that when he entered the elevator, the white woman clutched her handbag to her chest. That's the experience of being misrecognized. These incidents take their psychological toll. Being objectified and stereotyped, racially profiled, hurts, and each incident adds to an often unconscious pool of fear, hurt, and anger that the survivor of racism here must manage. And as the world was reminded last summer, these repetitive acts of misrecognition and outright white racism against African Americans are often lethal. Fortunately, Black Americans have never been passive victims. And once again, thousands asserted their rights to being heard and seen and acknowledged honestly, to have their lives matter. So where do monuments fit into this picture of rendering real African Americans unreal? In recent years, and accelerating in the past year, thanks to the activism of Black Lives Matter, there has been a long overdue push to remove statues and memorials, including the names of schools and roads, that honor the so-called heroes of the Confederacy who fought from April 1861 to April 1865 to protect the institution of slavery in the Southern states. While most of these monuments are in the South, many of us outside the South have been surprised to learn of our own streets or institutions named for men, almost always, who espoused white supremacist views. The toppling of these statues and the pledge, for instance, to rename all military bases who were named for Confederate figures has huge psychological significance. And this has been alluded to by some of you about, for instance, from Oxford, the story there. But when people have suffered trauma, recovery is possible when one's injury is acknowledged by both those close to the person and also by surrounding institutions. Traumatic events result in profound psychological damage when those validations are missing. For African Americans, slavery, Jim Crow, and ongoing racist violence have compounded trauma intergenerationally. And while they may receive support, the people may receive support and validation from within their families, churches, and community organizations, when they walk past statues of Robert E. Lee, or walk just to get to work, or live on a street named for a Confederate general, their sense of their histories and subjective experiences being invalidated is reinforced. The message that these statues convey is that the dominant official white society does not really acknowledge that racism or the desire to enslave Black people is bad, no matter who won the Civil War in 1865 or what the law says. When the local or state governments take it upon themselves to haul down the statues or to rename the streets, a psychological space is created for Black citizens to feel seen. The first, and this isn't exactly a monument, but in a certain way it is, the first National Museum of African American History did not open in the United States until September of 2016, nearly 400 years after the first African slaves arrived in this land. By November of that year, October, November, by November, more than 300,000 people had visited. But more amazing was that while people normally spend an hour and 45 minutes to 2 hours at museums, that's the total average apparently, people were spending up to 6 hours at this museum. One such visitor was a young man from New Jersey, and he said, wow, I can't even put it into a lot of really big words. I mean, it's just amazing just to see the fact that so many African Americans, the impact that we had on this country, it's mind-blowing. I had an idea of it before, but to actually see it and to see the displays and representation of African American culture is just, it's like, I can't even put it into words. An older man from Illinois who described himself as a reader and thus familiar with much of what was represented in the museum, nevertheless said, "It's really nice to see everything pulled together as you go through and you see everything. It's not so much that we deserve this, we are due this." So I think that's all of my time, if I'm correct. I'd have lots more to say, but I think my time is up.
Thank you. Thank you for your timekeeping. Yes, we will be discussing and responding to a few questions interactively. So there's going to be more time for more thoughts. And we have right now on the floor our next speaker and panelist, Cyrus Marcus Ware, who is an assistant professor at the School of the Arts, McMaster University. He is a Vanier scholar, visual artist, activist, curator, and educator. Cyrus uses drawing, installation, and performance to explore social justice frameworks and Black activist culture, and he's shown widely in galleries and festivals across Canada. He's a core team member of Black Lives Matter Toronto, where he is based, and part of the Performance Disability Art Collective, and an ABD PhD candidate at York University in the Faculty of Environmental Studies. In short, that's some of the background of Cyrus, and we welcome you this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for the chance to speak with you today. I'm coming to you from Toronto, or Takaranto, from the part that was underwater at the time of the Toronto Purchase, making this part actually the unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. This is Three Fires territory of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum. It's an honor to get to organize and work in these parts. So we, through Black Lives Matter, I'm a core organizer with Black Lives Matter Toronto and a co-founder of Black Lives Matter Canada. And through our work, we've been trying to address these massive monuments to slavery and colonialism that spread across this northern part of Turtle Island, the largest monument to slavery and colonialism being that of the police and prison system, right? So these are vestiges of the period of transatlantic slavery. These are monuments to slavery and colonialism. The police and prison system are one of the largest monuments to this work. So we have been trying to draw attention to the fact that this monument to slavery and colonialism needs to be dismantled. So we've done active campaigns around defunding the police, around abolishing the police and prison system, and around addressing white supremacy dyed in the wool here in Northern Turtle Island. This summer, we did a series of actions that were designed to talk about these monuments, to talk about what it is that we're putting up in public space and why it is that we're so obsessed with putting up images of colonizers, of racist folks, of these monuments to slavery and colonialism. First of all, we targeted the Toronto Police headquarters, as I mentioned, the largest monument to slavery and colonialism. We did a 7,500 square foot mural on the street in front of police headquarters in the queerest pink that we could find. We're a queer and trans-led group. And we spelled out defund the police in large, giant pink block letters. With 80 artists, we painted this mural and left it as a message to the city of Toronto. In the following month, in July, of course, this was all happening during the uprisings of last summer and this revolutionary moment that we find ourselves in. Of course, revolution is not a one-time event, but rather a process and a series of ongoing actions. So in the middle of this revolutionary moment, we painted this mural, and we decided that we were going to draw our attention also to some of the other monuments that are plaguing our city, that are dappled throughout the public landscape as constant reminders to racialized, marginalized, disabled, queer, and trans folks that we are not supposed to be here. So the monuments to, say, Canada's first prime minister, known racist and white supremacist, John A. Macdonald, the monument to Ryerson, the person who was the architect of the residential school system here in Northern Turtle Island. And also that system was exported to South Africa to become the apartheid regime that resulted in millions of African people dying and being affected by that regime. That Ryerson has a monument and a university named after him here in Takaranto. And then lastly, we drew our attention to the statue of King Edward the Sixth, which was this statue that was put in place in our Parliament buildings and in Queen's Park, and is a statue that actually was taken down in India during a decolonial process. People said, we don't want this monument in our communities, we want to take it down. They took it down, and then through private interest, it was purchased and brought to Takaranto and put up in one of our most beautiful parks, definitely making the park more ugly. So we decided to focus on these three monuments: the monument to John A. Macdonald, the monument to Ryerson, and the monument to King Edward VI. And we drew our attention to those monuments by beautifying them. So we did an action that involved paint, pink paint on these monuments that again tied back to our earlier action addressing police and prisons. The state reacted harshly to this action, and there were 3 arrests. 3 of our people were arrested, they were detained, they were held in jail overnight. They spent almost 24 hours in jail, were driven around in a hot police car for hours with nobody knowing where they were taken. Really, really serious breaches of human rights and justice happened during those arrests. It sparked this larger conversation about what we were going to do with these monuments. Since the summer and since those arrests, the city and the province have put up boarding around these same monuments to protect them from us, to protect them from the people who are giving their voice and responding about what we think of these monuments in the city. These monuments have been protected with a wood placard boarding that surrounds them, that gives them these statues, these cement and metal statues, gives them more permanent housing than the majority of people who are living in encampments in parks and city streets all over Takaranto. Because of COVID-19, we have a huge issue with houseless folks not having a safe place to go, with the shelters being full of COVID and people not feeling safe going to those environments. And so a lot of folks are living in encampments that are spread out throughout the city. There was a young Black man named Khalil Seavright, who has been building tiny shelters for houseless folks, and the city hates it. They're removing the shelters, they're destroying them, they're taking them down, all while keeping the shelters around these monuments intact and caring for these monuments more than they care about actual human life. So we've been really trying to think through, what are we doing? What are we doing as a people that these stone statues to white supremacists are considered more important and more valuable than the actual people living in the city? I'll just close by saying, because of what happened and because of our experience with these monuments this last summer, I did a project in the fall called Radical Love, where I was trying to think through what would we put up in place instead of statues and monuments to white supremacists? What would we want to see as monuments in our city that were about the kind of future that we're trying to build, this abolitionist, this free future? So I created a series of monuments that I called Radical Love. And there were these monuments, these series of 3 monuments to Black and Afro-Indigenous trans women and non-binary people as a way of celebrating folks who I thought were really deserving of monumentalization, you know, these Black trans activists who were doing all of this incredible work in our city. So I did portraits of Monica Forrester, who's a long-term Black trans activist and outreach worker here in Takaranto. Also portraits of Raven Wings, who's an Afro-Indigenous trans woman who's been doing organizing with Black Lives Matter Canada, and others. And I created these monuments as an offering to say, hey, what if instead of putting up monuments to white supremacy and colonialism, what if instead we put up monuments to people in our city who were doing great work to try to make sure that we were all that much freer? So that's what I've been trying to figure out is, if we take these monuments down, what do we put up in their place? And what do we need our city to look like for everybody to actually feel safe in public space? I know I don't feel safe when I walk through parks and I see statues of Donnie McDonald and other colonizers, you know, that are, you know, reminding me that as a Black person, as a disabled person, as a trans person, I'm not supposed to be in public space. So this is the space of the colonizer. So this is the work, right? We try to dismantle, defund, and abolish police and prisons and white supremacy writ large across this entire country. So through Black Lives Matter Canada, through Black Lives Matter Toronto, and through my artistic practice, I've tried to grapple with this question of what do we do with these monuments in public space. As I say, the largest one needs to be dismantled immediately, and that is the police and prison system. And so I encourage folks to check out, we made a website, defundthepolice.org, that has some great resources on how to go about defunding and what some alternatives to police and prison are. And it talks about the monuments there as well. So I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cyrus. Sorry I missaid your name at first. I apologize.
No worries.
Thank you for your word, and we have now received our next speaker. Not received. Our next speaker who wasn't here is now here, or they're here, and Lavon Vale is a multidisciplinary artist from the Virgin Islands. And for years, her work has responded to questions surrounding the coloniality of the Virgin Islands, both in its present relationship to the US and its past one to Denmark. Her work borrows from elements of architecture, literature, history, archaeology, and social protest to create narratives that challenge the colonial process. This is in short, a short introduction to Lavon. We welcome you this early morning, probably for you. Thank you for arriving. And after Lavon, we will move on to questions and answers. Thank you, Lavon. Look forward to hearing your talk.
Yes, it's morning for me. It's right about 9 o'clock. I'm talking to you guys from the Virgin Islands. I'd like to open by just beginning to share my screen and a short presentation about my work. Okay, can everybody see that? Are we okay? Okay, great. So thank you for the introduction. As you stated, I'm a visual artist based in St. Croix, US Virgin Islands. And my work, I think about it as a counter archive in some ways to the colonial archives. This image gives you a little bit of an example of where the Virgin Islands is kind of situated in our imaginary and also present day in our political situation. This is our government house. With the Virgin Islands flag in the middle and the Danish flag on the right and the US flag on the other side. Denmark was, although we've been colonized about 7 times, Denmark was the longest colonizer for about 250 years. And the United States has been the last colonizer for a little over 100 years. That anniversary of the sale and transfer of the Virgin Islands from Denmark to the United States happened in 2017. As an artist, I work with many different media. I first of all think about my work as a way to develop knowledge, a platform for thinking, a way to think through collective narratives. And so I've done a lot of different projects between video, public art, a social practice project like this one, which is thinking through this building that I bought in 2011 as to kind of stabilize my artistic practice. However, I learned that it ended up being a part of a neighborhood called Free Gut, which was where the first Blacks were relocated to live. The first registered owner of this building is from 1777. And so I started this journey of trying to tell the stories of these formerly enslaved people who were able to survive the Middle Passage, survive slavery, and purchase these homes. And during slavery times, this project completely transformed my artistic practice, as I did a lot of the work myself. It really helped me to think through about the narratives that are inscribed in places and the materiality of coloniality, so to speak. In some ways, these are monuments that dot the landscapes of the Virgin Islands. This is an example of a great house sugar plantation on the western end of St. Croix. And I had done a project basically inviting people to kind of situate themselves in this history by posing in this chair. It's called the planter's chair. I've also thought a lot about how, again, these histories can be inscribed in places. This piece is called Cuts and Burns, and it's thinking through the visuality of resistance. That town in Frederiksted was burnt down in 1878, which was the largest labor revolt in Danish colonial history. You'll see me talk a little bit more about this when I talk about the monument project that this led to, but I just wanted to kind of give you a trajectory of my artistic practice, because in essence, the monument I Am Queen Mary that was done, inaugurated in 2018 by myself and the Danish artist Jeanette Ehlers, is really a intersecting of two artistic practices from across the Atlantic. So this piece, Cuts and Burns, is thinking through the visuality of resistance. When we're thinking about any major resistance that happened in the Caribbean, they usually use two tools, which was cutting and burning. If you come to the Caribbean and you're trying to transform this quote unquote virgin landscape into plantations, what they did was they cut them, they burnt them down, and then they cut them. And so at the same time, enslaved people were able to use those tools and use them to fight their rebellions. For example, the Haitian Revolution was fought with those two weapons. So this is a series of work where I'm using small cuts and burns on paper. This is an example of the series that was transformed, almost thinking about a type of ledger. This piece was called Constructed Manumissions, and you can see echoed the idea of the house in the very beginning that I showed of the enslaved, the formerly enslaved. This is a house that's made, in some ways it looks kind of magical. It's thinking through that even though these people were no longer enslaved, that they had so many restrictions placed upon them. And we can probably see similarities to that today. But for example, although they were no longer enslaved and they were able to find them, get their manumission papers, as it was called, they had to carry those papers with them constantly. They weren't allowed to be out of the house after 10 o'clock. Enslaved men, free men had to hunt runaway slaves as a condition of their freedom. They weren't allowed to have certain business license. Women couldn't wear certain clothes like lace or chintz. So they had so many restrictions upon them that we can understand that the houses, like the one that my studio is in, then becomes a very special place. And so this piece kind of references the fragility of their freedom and also the precarity of it. This piece is called Trading Post, and it comes out of, these are some ruins that are found at my studio. They're coral stones that I found one day, and I had this kind of epiphany memory experience thinking through why these coral stones were there, and not only like why they had this mark, this very straight, like they almost look like sculptures. And I had remembered this story about the enslaved Africans being sent out into the ocean to cut the coral stones, harvest them, and that is actually used for all the colonial era buildings in the Virgin Islands. However, we don't really see that because on top, what's placed is a Danish brick that was imported from Flensburg. And so you only begin to see these coral stones when the buildings are in ruin and they start to fall apart, which I thought was a really interesting metaphor for thinking through the true wealth and foundation of many European societies that are often hidden, but only come out after the ruin. And this piece was actually my response to an invitation to think through doing a monument to commemorate that 2017 sale and transfer from the Virgin Islands, from Denmark to the United States. Here's an example of a rare example of how the coral stones might situate, and also the Danish brick on the right. And this is another piece that I had developed called Wall Rubbings, a record of work of others, which is pretty much taking a type of paper and recording in some ways the hand and the labor of these enslaved Africans, and then creating a wall-sized piece and a replica of that. I've also worked a lot with Danish colonial archives, the actual photographs and documents. Here's an example of a photographic album that I was introduced to in my very first trip to Denmark in 2008. And I was so struck by this image of this young child in pain. And it was a postcard image that was circulated over and over again. And I later did a series where I created these juxtapositions of images from those archives with my own personal family archives in terms of thinking through another means, thinking through other narratives. And this also is a piece called Errata, which I'm going to try to summarize very briefly because I know we don't have a lot of time, but it's a work also thinking about juxtaposition, thinking through colonial narratives in which I juxtapose a book in which erroneously described the work I was doing on this, the house that I had been renovating, with the archive of my interaction with the author as we're trying to work through the error and the mistake that she made about my story. And the purpose of the work really was to kind of highlight the ways that colonial archives have been produced and how they're still, how a lot of these projections are still being replicated today. I'm going to skip through these and jump to the project I Am Queen Mary. So I Am Queen Mary, as I mentioned before, it was a project thinking through the commemoration in 2017. How do you commemorate being passed from one colonial power to the other? That was the perspective of Virgin Islanders. It's a very awkward position to be in. But I had been approached by a Danish professor by the name of Helle Stenham to also, she recognized that artists were the ones that were having these critical conversations around the colonial past and the relationship between Denmark and the Virgin Islands. So she approached myself and Jeanette Ehlers to think about a project in which we would first do an intervention in these two warehouses. This is the one in Copenhagen on the left. It's the Danish West India warehouse where all the goods from the colonies would have been taken. And this is the warehouse in St. Croix, where a lot of the goods would have been housed. Jeanette comes out of a practice of performance art and thinking through colonial history by using her body as an Afro-Dane. And in this piece, she was taking black ash and whipping it onto a white canvas. And she uses that performance art piece and the character that was developed and merges it with this image of Huey P. Newton from the Black Panthers with a national heroine from the Virgin Islands called Queen Mary, who emerges as one of the leaders of this labor revolt that I mentioned earlier, in which much of the town of Fredrikstad was burnt down in protest of the very slavery-like living and working conditions. And on my side of the Atlantic, I had thought through this this project about using the coral stones and the materiality, very much thinking about my position as a Virgin Islander, living in the kind of aftermath and all the remnants of this colonial era. And together we decided not only to combine our two projects, as Jeanette was able to raise money in Denmark to complete her project, we decided, while my project was kind of left as an idea, which very much, again, reflects our different colonial positions and access to power, privilege, and resources. So we decided to work together and not only combine our two projects, but to combine our two figures, our bodies, to create the figure. Here's just a quick example of the process in which we're doing 3D body scans of our body, reenacting in many ways this revolt leader and figure. And then we later combine them. We're kind of rematerialized in the virtual space and then combine our two bodies to create the figure. The coral stones were imported from St. Croix, from my studio space, and in some ways they made a very symbolic gesture back across the Atlantic. And the piece was inaugurated on March 31st in 2018 with the simultaneous march by the Black Lives Matter chapter in Copenhagen, where they marched from across the canal, where not only Mary Thomas, but there were 3 other women who were sent to Denmark. First, they were sentenced to death for their participation in this labor revolt. And then later their sentences were commuted as they were kind of sent to Copenhagen to die. There's not that much known about what happened to the women after. Some of them were returned to the Virgin Islands, and their story kind of has been diffused into this more of a legend and a mythology around them. However, although they were very well known during the time that this happened in the 1800s, they've kind of been unremembered. I would say that, as opposed to forgotten in Denmark. And the size of the sculpture, well, I'll say first that what was very significant about this project is, as you've probably gleaned, is that it is an artist-driven project. It was not something that we were invited to do or commissioned to do. It was 2 Black female artists pushing into the public space and trying to claim that space. And but one of the things that we realized is, because for the centennial year, that 2017, there were lots of Danish institutions that were reluctantly interested in talking about their colonial history, but you could very much feel that they wanted to kind of close that chapter and kind of put it behind them, this part of their history. And so we knew that for our monument project to be permanent, because we had only received at the beginning temporary permission. For it to be permanent, we knew we had to extend the conversation beyond just the Virgin Islands and Denmark. And so we actually hired a PR company to help us do that. It was, although that's what we were aiming for, it was surprisingly an extremely successful campaign. And I think it had a lot to do with the way that this story resonates. It's not only about female empowerment, but when you think about the globe, if you were not a colonizing nation, you were a colonized nation. And so I think the story very much connected with many different resistance movements and people and colonized peoples. So it was, it had a reach of over 100 media outlets in over 25 countries. And in terms of the title, it was very significant for us, and thinking about, well, first in the Virgin Islands, I knew it would be controversial that we were using our image to create this.
Lavon, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt you.
We're running out of time.
Questions and answers. So
okay,
you have 15 seconds right now to wrap up. Thank you.
Well, that's great, because I'm at the end.
Thanks. 15 seconds. Thanks.
Thank you. So I just wanted to, I guess, update you on where we are. The sculpture has received permanent permission, and we invite everyone to kind of follow our journey at iamqueenmary.com, and to follow us on the social media platforms, as well as we're now beginning to raise $1.5 million to make the sculpture in a bronze cast, permanent in Copenhagen, and as well as a companion sculpture in the Virgin Islands. So thank you. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you. So Sulpadyush, thank you each and every one of our speakers and panelists for your dissertations and your word and your experience. We have some questions that we have prepared for you all, and we would like to facilitate them right now. I will start with question number one, the second part of question number one. What do you think, if you think that museums can be understood as monuments, reminders of colonial past, keeping hostage objects and stories from other cultures, that is to say, exerting oppression? And if that is the case, what action should we take to revert this? So I will, just to circle back, I would like to start with Professor Shirikure. If you have anything to say about this, you're welcome to start the discussion, Professor, if you're there, and if not, someone else can just, you know, answer.
Briefly, yeah, I would think that museums, and also given their histories, most of them are indeed monuments of oppression, and they also collect objects and material culture, which in itself oppresses people, particularly the minorities and so on. So that's why there is a lot of talk in terms of decolonization of the museums, and also trying to ensure that the collections themselves they are well contextualized, such that the stories that of the people who are marginalized can be heard. Is contextualization enough? If you go to a museum such as the British Museum, which has an eclectic collection of objects from all over, will a label say that this was planted in Benin, Nigeria in 1897 be sufficient? Will putting a label on the Elgin marbles saying, well, these were smuggled in 1816, you know, during when Greece was under Ottoman tech, under the Ottoman Turkey, will that help? How about the violence? Why not just take those objects and give them to the Greeks, give them to the Nigerians? You know, this perhaps also speaks to the existential questions. What then will happen to museums when that has happened? I don't think that will lead to the destruction of any museums, because there's so much to collect. I think let me end here and also hear what others would say.
I have some thoughts about that. One is that my husband actually had this great idea of why not do trades where, you know, Africa, you know, say Benin will loan their pieces to the British Museum, if the British Museum will loan some pieces of European art for 6 months to a museum in Benin, you know, that they can do trades, because people do like to see things from other places, but not, you know, not keep them permanently. The other thing that actually I was going to, you know, I thought about talking about it, and my main thing is that there are these alternative memorials or museums. In 2018, there was in Montgomery, Alabama, was erected a national memorial for peace and justice that grew out of research about lynching. And it's this incredible monument that to all the people, they did research to discover, the Equal Justice Initiative, to discover, try to name and find each person who was lynched in the United States, each Black person lynched in the United States, and erected this incredible memorial that on a 6-acre site that has sculpture, art, lots of beautiful, evocative, haunting, moving memorializing of these human beings, and it's that's an alternative, a kind of monument that is and that discovers history and remembers it in its accuracy, and is it can be gut-wrenching, but it's also important, it's real.
From my perspective, it's what are museums there for? And we have to really think about what museums are there for, and they should be learning spaces. They should be spaces which ignite debate and discussion. I've sat on enough panels with museum curators and people who work in museums to know that museums are not neutral spaces. So when we talk about history, it's about the value of history and whose value of history, and that juxtapositioning of value. From my perspective, that when I go to St. Vincent, it absolutely kills me. I love museums. I love learning. That our museum is almost empty because it's, where is it? Where is everything? And I think that there has to. I love that idea of kind of swaps and loans and moving stuff around. That's, we do move exhibitions around the world. They do ignite debate and discussion, but we have to remember where it belongs, and it has to always belong to the people where it was taken from, because that is their history. And so I think there has to be that point of recognizing that it doesn't belong to the people who own the museum, that if they want to keep it and they want to use it as a learning space, then they need to compensate for it. And I like that idea of swapping, because it would be nice to have, I guess it would be nice to see the crown jewels go to India, back where they belong, and have that as an opportunity to learn about colonialization. And I think that's what the story has to be. The history has to be learning about how these objects, how these items ended up where they were, and not be used as an opportunity to whitewash the history. And so that's what I see museum spaces are. They should be where they ignite that debate and that discussion and that knowledge learning and sharing.
Thank you.
And I've been working in museums for...
I'm sorry, dear Cyrus.
Yes,
I'm
right of time.
No, we need to address the next question, which is the right question for this panel. Even though the museums, of course, are a relevant topic, we had another question prepared, so we're gonna move straight to that. The question is, what creates effective synergies on the World Heritage stage, particularly in a period where mental well-being is stressed for individuals negatively, affected by oppressive monuments and discourses, and the widespread attention the subject has attracted in terms of support and awareness, but also a noticeable backlash from groups associated with right-wing politics, xenophobia, homophobia, patriarchal tendencies, and so on. It is I think this question we will start with Petrona or Cyrus, since you were about to speak. You can go after Petrona.
Sure thing.
I actually I have no idea what effective synergies means. So if Cyrus would like to go first, I'd love to be educated on the topic.
Yeah, well, I wasn't sure I totally understood the question. So I was like, oh, great, I can hear Patrona speak and then I can know what to say. But I mean, I think in general, I mean, maybe if you, I'll just say that, you know, these monuments and statues that we've created, these monuments, you know, become these objects of focus in the city, you know, they become this priority, you know, and I think that that's what we've all been speaking to. Is like, we could imagine something vastly different, you know, that there is a possibility of building, you know, this community of care and mutual aid and this idea that we take care of each other. You know, some of these monuments that we've described, the artistic projects that are like alternative monuments, the counter archives, are options of inserting into the city a different narrative. You know, we need something better than what we currently have. This is a revolutionary moment that we find ourselves in, and people are rising up all over the world and saying enough. We need change, and we need change now. So these, the legacy of colonialism, the legacy of white supremacy that has dyed in the wool in most of the places of this planet needs to be changed. You know, we need to uproot white supremacy. And these statues are like the mushrooms, you know, that are growing above the ground, but underneath there's this entire network of white supremacy that is being fed and nourished and watered daily. And that is what we need to uproot. And so I don't know if that answered the question, but I think like we're all saying, hey, we've got a problem here and we can do something different. We've already seen examples of artists who are creating alternatives. We've talked about the ways that the cityscape can look differently. You know, we've talked about the way that the government could possibly imagine a different kind of view of our city. So change needs to happen, and it needs to happen now.
Yeah. I just wanted to maybe comment on this concept of synergy that I think was really sparked last summer. Here in the Virgin Islands, we have a public space that's called Emancipation Gardens, but inside of it was the only sculpture that was in it was of a Danish king that had been there previously. And it was just this complete conflict in the public space, which I think very much has reflected our colonial mentality. But that synergy and people had been asking for it to be removed for many, many, many years. But I think that there was something about that moment that allowed it forced people to pay attention. We have a different kind of community, and so I don't think people were going to necessarily tear it down and throw it into the ocean, although that might have also been an option. You know, but there was a petition circulated. The monument actually comes down this week, and so we're very excited about that. Through just again a very grassroots organized effort. But I think for the project that I'm been working on with Jeanette, it really got us. We kind of predated that synergy moment as our sculpture came up in 2018. But I think it's a good example of showing that there can be alternative gestures, and that these new projects, even though like ours, it may look like a traditional monument, it is very much not only speaking to the past, the present, and the future in terms of what a cityscape can look like.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I think more than the question is how do we center our stories in this matter, and less talking about white supremacy and more talking about us is one avenue. Does someone else want to contribute to this discussion?
We are also talking about power and how that power is.
Can go next.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So if we say synergies, you mentioned the word world heritage, right? Who has got the power and who has no power in that? So the decision making where you have state parties and with a criteria, and then this is accepted as world heritage with outstanding universal value. So if I am a villager in South Africa, what power do I have in that great scheme of things? By synergies, are you also hinting at co-option? That because in those communities we don't have power to challenge the might of the state and the might of the international system. So that's one of the major problematic, that we want to build synergies, we want to engage with communities, we want all those things that are high sounding and that are good in principle, but in reality, when it comes to action, we find ourselves, with no power at all. So how do we get to that? Is this just going to be talk? Is it just going to be a question of where there will be a real a change based on a bottom-up approach? These are issues that are open to debate, but this thing of just saying, let's build synergies in a top-down approach, in some cases, and as history has shown, it doesn't result in any fundamental change. Things will still remain the same, that the Nigerians are not involved at all in the return of the Benin bronzes. It's a discourse which is taking place elsewhere, and they have no power, they have no say. So this is an appropriation of the language, just to say what people want to hear, but then do nothing. But I hope that on a more optimistic note, these conversations we are having will stimulate a real change.
I really appreciate what you just said about the co-option of oppression. I think that's really important. Like when we're talking about like the museums giving stuff back, to who? And I think it's important to listen to affected people. Here in Washington, D.C., we have a bunch of museums. We got the National Museum of the American Indian. We have the National Museum of African American History. We have the National Museum of African Art. We have the National Museum of Asian Art. We have a billion museums, and each of them are all on stolen land, on sacred land, on lands that have been brutalized. And the local indigenous people are not considered when these when these buildings are being constructed. And furthermore, when we talk about like new museums that are built, like for instance, the American Latino Museum that is going to be built soon, what that monument represents, because what is an American Latino? And it's reference to a very diverse group of people that include Black people, includes American Indians, includes white people, includes Asian people. And when we look at the museums that already exist, the National Museum of the American Indian, that has the Inca Road, that has all these different projects that have to do with indigenous people of Latin America, we see that the museums that already exist are already including indigenous people of Latin America. And like, for instance, the Anacostia Community Museum that has exhibits about the Afro community in Washington, D.C. that's from Latin America, specifically the Afro-Panamanian community and other Black communities from Latin America that are here. It's like this movement that's led by criollos and mestizos, led by whites and mixed race people, that is being co-opting like this oppression of these other folks that are already being represented in these colonial museums. And instead of saying like, hey, we need more of these things in these museums, they're saying we need to colonize more land. We need to destroy more land so that we can create more spaces where we can celebrate 1492, where we can celebrate Christopher Columbus, where we can celebrate Queen Elizabeth and other Latinos who did great work so that we can have an America. And when we look at the objects that exist in these museums, in the American Indian Museum, there's objects that belong to the Maya nations, the Lenca nations, the Nahua people. And when we see what happens to these people, these are the people that I come from, the Nahua, Maya, and Lenca people, that are criminalized for existing in Washington, D.C., that are put into ICE detention camps, another monument of oppression. we don't, and there's no recognition for the Maya Lenca Nation. There's no recognition for the Nahua people in Washington, D.C. And still our objects are being used in museums, and our elders back home are being kept from us. They're being kept from us, and they have no say into what's happening in these museums. And those are the people that are most affected. The people that are most affected are the elders who are back home, and the community that the elders are with, that are protecting the elders from colonization. And yes, I really appreciate this conversation.
Thank you for that reflection, and so relevant and precise, really. We have some questions on the chat. Our time is running up for this amazing morning, afternoon panel. Really honored to be here with all of you and listen to your stories, your narratives. And we have one question here. Are monuments not a form of recolonization in the sense that we want to use the language of the oppressor to tell our stories about those we admire within a given period? It's on the chat box.
Well, I created a series of monuments that I described called Radical Love. And I mean, I suppose, yes, monuments, in their original conceptualization were designed to mark a victory of a colonizer. They were designed to mark, particular processes of the state, and to celebrate, a very limited scope of people who we consider to be inherently valuable. I believe in taking them back. I don't, as an artist, I believe that the idea of having a public artwork in a public space is a good idea. I don't think that that's a bad idea. I think that the framing of using this artwork in public space to tell a narrative of white supremacy and colonialism could be changed. We could create artworks in public space that talk about mutual aid. We could create artworks in public space that talk about activist history. We could create artworks in public space that talk about, the kinds of futures that we're trying to build towards. So they could be speculative, envisionings. We could use artwork in public space in a lot of different ways, and we need not let the use of monuments by colonizers to detract us away from this idea of art in public space. When I imagine our future cities, I imagine them full of artwork in public space, full of dedications and celebrations of organizers, of activists. I want to see portraits and monuments to Miss Major and Marsha P. Johnson. I want to see monuments to our children. I want to see monuments to the kinds of worlds that we're trying to build. I think that we can reclaim this in the same way that we talk about counter-archiving as a way of responding to archiving. We can counter-monumentalize things. We can, imagine, the use of public space to tell a story that we want to tell, that future generations will want to hear.
I, of course, totally agree. Thank you so much. I mean, I feel like we're kindred spirits in that idea. As our project, I Am Queen Mary, is exactly that. It is a counter to this idea. She stands as tall as she is because she is a counter to the Danish kings that dot throughout the city. She's a counter to the other sculptures in the public space that are 99% of white men. And I think that for us, it was very important, the titling of the monument, because it's also speaking to this idea of heroizing, which I think is a question that the panelist is also asking, by inverting that and using this idea of a declaration of presence as a form of resistance by titling the work I Am Queen Mary, because it's not only, of course, telling you who she is, but it's asking you to insert yourself inside of this history and your relationship to this history, and kind of signaling this heroization that typically happens in monument, but also realizing that you also can connect and you can also be like this, like this person. So, I mean, I think, thank you for that question, because I do think it's something that to consider, the language of monuments, and what they actually do.
I have another thought about monuments that are successful, and it goes back to what I was talking about earlier about how white supremacy and racism sort of de-individualizes the other, you know, whether it's Black people or Asian Americans or whatever. One of the most successful and most moving monuments that I've ever seen is in Washington, D.C., and it's the memorial wall to the veterans of the Vietnam War. Now, the American War in Vietnam, which was a horrible, stupid, you know, highly controversial war. And the monument, this wall, which lists, if you don't know how it's structured, it's by a wonderful designer named Maya Lin, and it's a long wall that by the year lists the names of every single person, every single American who died that year in the war, in fighting the war. It's not making a statement supporting the war, glorifying the war. You know, it's not a monument to the generals who ran the war, but it's a very moving memorial, living memorial to the people who died. And what makes it a very powerful memorial is that individuals who come, you know, their family member, and they'll do a rubbing or they'll leave notes for the person. And there's actually, I'd love to see an exhibit where they collect, I guess at the end of the day, some agency sort of, you know, preserves these things that were left there, flowers or whatever. That's preserving, it's not ideological. In fact, you know, I go there as an anti-war activist in a way, and and you feel the grief of this, you know, loss of human lives. And in a similar way, that museum that I mentioned, and it's not a museum, but the memorial for the memory of people lynched, it's their names. They have collections of the soil where the people were lynched, you know, that grounds it in individual, real people. So I think there is a place for that kind of a memorial too, or that kind of a monument.
Sorry, can I come in? Or is there another question, Frida?
Please go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you. I mean, from my perspective, there are so many moving parts to when we talk about monuments and what that actually means and what it means to different people. I really struggle and try to actually completely negate the argument if we lose these statues and memorials, we lose history, as if we haven't got Wikipedia. I don't understand where this argument comes from, that if we lose it, we're not going to be able to remember it. And then I love that argument about actually, instead of getting rid of statues, actually we need more monuments, we need more recognition across the landscape. One of the things that I found I've been really lucky is in my role as a national president is I've been able to be in spaces with people from across the world, and it really hits me when I hear my colleagues and trade unionists and activists from around the world pay memorial to the land that they're on. And for me that always absolutely hits me, and it actually really pulls the ground from underneath my feet in a sense, because I don't know where I belong. I know that when I go back to St. Vincent, where my family are from, as soon as I step off the plane, I feel this sense of feeling like home, but I don't know where my ancestors' land is. I don't know where they're from. I can do the research, I can try and do the research, but I know a lot of the records have been lost. And so there's this idea of what is the conflict, because at the end of the day, I've got my name. I'm irrespective of Christopher Codrington, whose name I wasn't even able to spell. I am a Codrington. And that's where these people, these white supremacists, did what I am always telling kids off at school for doing. They graffitied onto, our kids at school draw on tables and put their graffiti on it. These supremacists have graffitied people, humans. I haven't changed my name, and I could have changed my name, not because of Christopher flipping Codrington, but because that is a link to people who my ancestors were in that struggle with. So on one hand, I kind of argue and say, well, actually removing statues is the easy part, because you can remove a statue, but the damage and the repair is the hard work that needs to be done. And when we have, for example, colleges, etc., changing their names or changing names of parts, actually we need them to do the hard work as well. I could get an apology, but what does that reparation look like? And I think that's why I say it's about a lot of moving parts, because actually removing a monument or a statue is almost the easy part of it.
Thank you. That is some great closing remarks. Monuments are in themselves a homage to colonialism. This is not related to our, cosmovision in any way. So for us, the tree is our monument, right? Those are our relatives, and those are, our ancestors too. So it's a totally different mindset, the one we live in, and of course, that's where we live in. So we have to accept that too, that we're a part of contemporary life. Yet, the more we resist through our language and through our way of living, the more we practice anti-monumentalism. So thank you very much, dear panelists and speakers. This has been a wonderful way to start at least my day here at 5 a.m. And then I still got confused with the time, even though I was reminded. And thank you very much to each one of you, Professor Shirikure, Michelle, Ruth, Petrona, Cyrus, Lavon. It has been a pleasure to be here with you all. And next, thank you. Next, our next part of the program is the visual storyboards. And so we invite you. Suksul Payush. Yektunal to everyone.
Thank you.
Ande.
Okay, so my name is Fernand Bodo, and I will present the visual storyboards that I created related to the topic oppression from monuments. I will share my screen now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so you can see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, I will start the presentation now. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the last part of today's conference, the visual boards from around the world, presented by me, Fernand Bodo. I will talk about the visual boards I created related to the theme oppression from monuments, but this is not only the thing that I will present. I will also show you some examples, meaning initiatives that are dealing with exactly this issue. First, I will start with a short introduction about myself and how I got involved with work on heritage. And after that, I will show you my creative side and explain a little bit about my inspiration for the boards I designed. Afterwards, I will highlight 3 contemporary examples of marginalized groups and their situation regarding heritage in general and world heritage specifically. My presentation will end with 3 student-led initiatives that deal with monuments and shared memory. As I said, I would like to first introduce myself and say how I got involved in the field of heritage. So it was initiated through my final thesis, which I did at the Faculty of Architecture at the Technical University of Munich. I have to say that my project was looking at modernist architecture in Africa generally speaking. but more precisely, I did a case study on post-independence buildings in Cameroon. I wanted to know if and how much of post-colonial or post-independence architecture was considered as national heritage. It might be considered as quite utopian, but I have this image of architecture and education around it that could play a key role in future cultural policy strategies in the African context. And what I mean by that is that I believe modernist architecture could maybe serve as a psychological tool to reconcile the memory of a whole nation with its memory of its own violent past, meaning the degradation of one's own culture in multiple ways during the colonial era. And this is so especially because not just me, but also many other post-colonial scholars believe that Europe cannot claim exclusive rights to modernity. What inspired me to go into the field and research about modernism in Africa was a publication released in 2016 by architect Manumissions, in which he represents his 2-year research on architecture and urban planning, which was created in Africa, in African states after independence after 1960. Even though it's a quite thick book, he's just focusing 5 countries: Ghana, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, and Zambia. Nevertheless, I decided to find out about this type of architecture in the country where I was born, in Cameroon. In 2016, the year before I started with my thesis, the work of the Swiss architect Le Corbusier was granted World Heritage status during the 40th session of the World Heritage Committee in Istanbul. According to UNESCO, his architectural work represents a masterpiece of human creative genius, providing an outstanding response to certain fundamental architectural and social challenges of the 20th century. Until then, I only knew of ancient buildings getting this special status. I said to myself, if UNESCO could grant a World Heritage status to a building from the modern era, how about the national government of a country like Cameroon? How do they deal with architectural heritage, in particular with architecture from the 20th century? I found out that there are, in fact, remarkable buildings which stem from the euphoric years after independence, which are lost as part of the modernist movement, which took place around the world. However, I face a strong discrepancy when it comes to acknowledging the heritage status in comparison with buildings stemming from pre-colonial era. From my perspective, when it comes to architectural heritage, the national pride lies in pre-colonial times in Cameroon. My research showed me that there was nothing but denial of modernist buildings as national heritage because this form of architecture is considered as non-African. There wasn't any space for modernist monuments or buildings in the legal documents which regulate what is and what is not considered as cultural heritage. And this led me to approach the Ministry of Arts and Culture in Cameroon to start working together on the heritage issues in Cameroon. So this is about my background, and now we go to the visual boards. I have prepared some images which have questions as title. And I was asked by the organizing team of this conference if I could do these visual boards. And for me, it was more of a request, like a creative challenge. I try to convey through digital art what came to my mind when I thought of heritage and world heritage, justice, injustice, diversity, gender, and of course, monuments and oppression. As you can see, what I have designed is quite colorful and expressive. I would say that this is the mood our world is in right now. We are in motion, diverse, in a mode of resistance, unclear to define, and overthinking our own status quo. I conceive the art boards as postcards. which are supposed to tell different stories. The ones that I have prepared for this presentation deal mostly with inequalities from the global south, because I myself, I'm mostly related to issues going on in the global south. The concept is to juxtapose or show what I interpret as oppressive monuments. In this image, for example, as we can see, actually it's a monument in Sao Paulo, Brazil, which celebrates the pioneers that started the first expeditions into the center of Brazil. And they also did a genocide. Okay. On the postcards, you can see also stamps that show buildings that are World Heritage. Here, you can see on this image, you can see a building by Le Corbusier. It's an example of of modernist architecture. I think it's one of the most recent. Well, I mean, the architecture is one of the most recent ones. So I will continue with the next topic that so I wanted to state 3 examples of marginalized groups, oppressed marginalized groups. One is the Black Lives Matter movement, but I think we have heard a lot about this today. And the second one is the Stonewall Uprising, which I have all represented in my visual storyboards, and also the marginalized indigenous group. So I will just resume again about the Black Lives Matter movement. After George Floyd protested in 2020, which took place predominantly in North America and Europe. I probably don't really have to explain what the Black Lives Matter movement is. However, the movement, which has become a global network, started actually in 2013 as a response to the shooting of Trayvon Martin, a 12-year-old unarmed African American. His death and unequal circumstances sparked a nationwide discussion of racism in the United States, which was also received in other countries. After a 1-month trial in 2013, the person who killed Martin was found not guilty. And as we all know, the racial justice against Black people in the United States and around the world did not stop or diminish. Last year, in 2020, the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor gained worldwide attention, especially in Europe, where there was a visibly strong sense of solidarity. Along with the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, which we have seen in the media, came calls for the removal of statues of racists from public space. This has generated a debate about the role of statues in the public sphere. I'm pretty sure that many of us can surely point to a monument in their city that commemorates slavery or colonialism. The Black Lives Matter movement in this regard has targeted a few monuments in cities around the world to make a statement that they would no longer accept these oppressive structures, which are a representation of our government that clearly supports violence and racism. And the Black Lives Matter movement is not a drive to remove or topple statues, but a call for an honest examination of systemic racism and the effects of slavery. Now I will talk shortly about the LGBTQ, the Stonewall Uprising. The Stonewall Uprising in Lower Manhattan were a series of protests which catalyzed America's gay rights movement. These protests were a response to the police raid in June 1969 in the Stonewall Inn, the popular gay bar in Greenwich Village in New York. Very few establishments welcomed gay people in the 1950s and the 1960s. Those establishments that did were often bars run by organized crime groups due to illegal nature of gay or LGBTQ bars at that time. The Stonewall Inn was known to be popular among the poorest and the most marginalized people in the gay community. Police raids on gay bars were routine in the 1960s. Officers quickly lost control of the situation at the Stonewall Inn in June 28. Within weeks, village residents quickly organized into activist groups to concentrate efforts to establishing places for gay men and lesbians to be open about their sexual orientation without fear of being arrested. During a conference of homophile organization in 1916, a young activist called for a nationwide demonstration each June in honor of Stonewall. New York's first Pride Parade, named the Christopher Street Liberation Day, was held in June of 1970, just a year after the riots. The march began on Christopher Street, where the bar, now a historic landmark, was located, and it ended in Central Park. The event attracted thousands and signaled another important milestone. In the years that followed, more cities and towns organized parades in support of gay rights. Well, I see this as an important example because, as I've just mentioned, the Stonewall Inn has become a historic landmark. In the United States, this place stands symbolically for the birthplace of the gay rights movement. I'm not sure if UNESCO's World Heritage List also includes the history of non-binary and gay people. And the last example I want to talk about is the indigenous people in Brazil. So I will talk about indigenous people organization. So in 2013, the Guarani Rupa Commission, an autonomous political organization that represents the indigenous Guarani people in the south and southeast of Brazil, decided to demonstrate in São Paulo. So it was the largest indigenous demonstration that occurred in São Paulo since the liberation fight of indigenous people in the 16th century. Over 4,000 people were part of this demonstration, with some 500 belonging to this tribe and 200 from another tribe, and actually more than half of the demonstrants were non-indigenous supporters. So they marched towards this large monument, which is called Monumentos às Bandeiras. It commemorates the 20th century settling expeditions into the interior of Brazil and the pioneers who participated in them. So myself, I have seen this monument in São Paulo, and it's quite huge and in a very prominent location. So when the protesters arrived at the monument, the indigenous climbed up and hoisted a red cloth that represented the blood of the ancestors, which was shed by the pioneers. Some non-indigenous supporters painted the monument with the red paint. What I find interesting is the fact that the media reported about this act of protest rather as an artistic happening. However, for the indigenous, the monument ceased to be in honor of the genocide that diminished the indigenous people and became a monument to their resistance. One representative of the indigenous tribe said that only at that moment, the monument of the Bandeiras became the true public heritage, as it stopped serving only colonizing symbolism of the elites to give voice to the indigenous people who are the true native to Brazil. Ever since this protest in March 2013, the monument has been the subject of criticism for neglecting the darker side of the pioneers depicted in the sculpture who killed and enslaved indigenous people. The monument regularly attracts the so-called vandalism, such as the red paint symbolizing blood. And more recently, in the wake of the toppling statue of Edward Colston in the UK in 2020 as part of the global Black Lives Matter protest, the monument has come under renewed criticism for its celebration of enslavement and genocide and demands for its removal. So now we have come to the last part of my presentation. I would like to show you 3 student-led initiatives that deal with shared heritage and oppression from monuments. So the first one I will present is the Uncomfortable Oxford, or now called the Uncomfortable Oxford Project. They have been part of the previous panel. So it's an organization founded by 2 PhD students from the Department of History at the Oxford University. But prior to this, I briefly want to talk about the heavily discussed movement, which was actually initiated in South Africa, Rhodes Must Fall. I guess you already have heard of this. If one here has heard of the Oxford controversialities, the name Rhodes Must Fall isn't far. The statue of Cecil Rhodes is probably one of the most discussed topics around Oxford University. In 2015, students of the University of Oxford, including recipients of the Rhodes Scholarship, considered one of the most prestigious scholarships in the world, called for the statue of Rhodes to be removed from the university building, and started a movement at the university to better represent non-white culture in the curriculum, as well as to combat racial discrimination and insensitivity. Organizing members of Rhodes Must Fall in Oxford stated that awareness should be raised at the university about the institution's implication in colonialism and the violence that accompanied it, and the representation of Black voices should be improved. So back to Uncomfortable Oxford. Olivia and Durand and Paula Larson had a similar idea, but different to Rhodes Must Fall. They did not only set their focus on the inquiry of the university, but the city as a whole. They developed a plan to implement walking tours in Oxford that raised uncomfortable discussions about the built urban landscape and its connection to imperialism, colonialism, and global histories of oppression and equality. This year, the walking tours by Uncomfortable Oxford is already in its 3rd cycle and has quite become a success story. Before the pandemic, there were various walking tours available, each focusing on different aspects and periods of Oxford's history. Now, during the pandemic, Uncomfortable Oxford still provides guided online walking tours. Among them is the classical Uncomfortable Oxford Tour, which is a general guide to the city highlighting most prominent controversies, including the Cecil Rhodes statue outside of a university building, war memorial statues, and discussions on the politics of historical memory. And the Uncomfortable Literature Tour, this one focuses on Oxford publishing and literature history and the controversies surrounding Oxford's authors, as well as highlighting authors who were overlooked due to their gender, race, or nationality. What I find interesting is that Uncomfortable Oxford was also involved in the removal of the Rhodes statue in Oxford. But unlike the preceding movement, Rhodes Must Fall, which received a lot of criticism, the Uncomfortable Oxford initiative received support. So the next student-led initiative is that I'm going to present is called A History of Everyone Else, which was founded by a duo from London, Rihanna Ilube and Mira Somji. They both met at the University of Cambridge during their undergraduate studies in political science. Now they live in London to study gender studies and theater science. Together, they launched their platform called A History of Everyone Else in 2020. It was a platform which functions mainly as a monthly video series available on YouTube, and it is a response to the dominant great man story of British imperialism. Every month, Rihanna and Mira research a different moment in history they were never taught at school and discuss these topics with other students and scholars in a quite creative way. All their episodes aim to center those who have been sidelined from history. For example, the resistance movement, stigmatized social groups, artists, young people, and many more. A history of everyone's work is rooted in the belief that history should be understood by everybody. However, when I talked to them, I found out that the idea to build this platform did not come up just like this. Earlier in 2020, they had started a petition campaign to topple a statue in front of the Foreign Commonwealth Office in London. Right now, they're at around 88,000 signatures. And I think their goal is to get 150,000 signatures. So the statue in front of the Foreign Office is the statue of Robert Clive, or also known as Clive of India. He is best known for laying the foundation of the British Empire in India. It's his victory over the French and their ally, the Nawab of Bengal, that opened the way for the domination of the subcontinent by England's East India Company. The administration of Clyde created, the administration that Clyde created looted the wealth of the land and starved the people, leading to a famine that cost at least 1 million lives. In the summer of 2020, when the Black Lives Matter protests swept over to Europe, Mira and Rihanna witnessed over Twitter how protesters in Bristol threw the statue of Edward Colston into the river. He was known for leading into capturing and enslaving 84,000 African people. A few years later, they cycled over to, a few days later, Mira and Rihanna cycled over to the Clive statue to express their protest. They took out a piece of cardboard and wrote a message. It's time to stop being proud of the British Empire. Clive, looter of the Bengal. So actually, I didn't talk much about the history of everyone else yet, their actual project, but I will introduce it to you through one specific episode. So in the episode of last February of A History of Everyone Else, Rihanna and Mira had an amazing conversation with the founders of a Berlin-based Pan-African collective called Isuzu Fena. And the founders' names are Nora Shirikure and Tonderai Koshke, both of Zimbabwean and German heritage. So they talked about the Berlin Conference, a conference where colonial leaders met in Berlin in 1884 to formalize the scramble of Africa without a single representative from an African state. And in this conversation, they used this moment to discuss the active resistance against colonialism that was happening in Africa in the same time. They delved into the history of Zimbabwe and the first Chimurenga, or the War of Independence, that took place around the same time. So a prominent figure who emerged during that time was a female resistance fighter, Mbuya Nehanda, who was hanged. In Zimbabwe right now, there is a discourse around the erection of a statue of her. In the talk, they talk critically about the implication of this. In general, they talked about how these histories are remembered differently in different places. On the one hand, by a small, disrespectful plaque in Berlin, and on the other hand, by a new statue of Zimbabwean resistance fighter Mbuya Nehanda. Beyond speaking to a history of everyone else, Isuzu Fena has also initiated conversations with government officials in Berlin about the insufficient remembering of the Berlin Conference of 1884, which obviously had a great impact on Black lives and around the world until today. At the beginning of this year, They held a conference together with the Center for Political Education discussing exactly this issue. The main discussion was around the physical place where the conference took place. It's a prominent road where many historic events took place, which are commemorated by many statues, infographics, and urban interventions. However, Nora and Tonderai from Isusufena highlighted that the Berlin Conference was only remembered in the early 20s by an organization called Africa Forum. And it is the small private group organization and not the German government that organized and funded a plaque in front of the building where the conference took place. So you can see this on this image. This is apparently the monument that should represent the Berlin Conference, or yeah. There is a lack of discourse around the pictures used on the plaque, which still shows unnamed and unchained African bodies with no thought to their dignity. So Isusufena points out that in Germany, there's not only a lack of discourse around the Berlin Conference, but in general about the implications of Germany and colonialism in general. I think this was my presentation. Yeah. So if you would like to follow Isusufena and the history of everyone else, I can put it in the chat. Yeah.
That was such an amazing presentation, Fernand. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Most of us have been up pretty early, so I'll be brief. So Fernand's presentation brings us to the end of a fantastic first day, where we tackled themes of decolonization, public art and architecture, reparations, heritage, reclamation, memory, and reimagination in the face of ongoing socio-political and epistemic injustice perpetuated through the physical monuments and the oppression that they represent. And so to begin the vote of thanks, I would like to thank our lead organizers, Dr. Sophia Labate and Dr. Tuki Lotam Brown, who have spearheaded this entire initiative and got everything organized. Next, I would like to thank our panelists, which include Adaku Ezweyo, Dr. Sahid Bawa, our colleagues from Uncommon Ground in Oxford, Olivia, Jess, Inez, Dr. Elena Sementini, and of course, our evening panelists, Professor Shadrach Shirikude, Michelle Cottington Rogers, Ruth Fallenbaum, Lavon Bell, Petrona, and Cyrus. Of course, our moderators, Elisa Uterin and Frida Lauris. We had prayers from Ade Williams, and of course, the Diversities and Genders team, Carl Godwin, Tony Smith, Paloma Bergen, Fernand, of course, Dr. Luce, Marco Acri, Surima Bansal, and everybody else that pitched in and pulled their weight and made sure that this entire event was as successful as it has been. Even though we've had a couple setbacks, I think the conversations and insights that were generated were very good. They were excellent. They're putting us on the right path. Now we just need to actually activize and apply some of the things we were talking about. And so please join us for the second part of the conference. It's a different registration link, so you will have to register for that, and you can still do that from our events page. And I hope to see you all there tomorrow. Thanks for coming. I think we can all unmute and give ourselves a round of applause.